Can the Capitals earn a wild card spot?
Your Locked On Capitals, your daily podcast on the Washington Capitals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Well, hello and welcome into this edition of Locked On Capitals. I'm so glad you decided to join me today. As always, this podcast is free and available on all the major platforms. And I want to thank you for making this your first listen or view of the day. Yes, this podcast is also available in video form, so head on over to YouTube and check it out. My name is Dan Holme. You can find me on Twitter. It's at DanCaps218. You can find the show on Twitter. It's at Locked On Caps. Also, I would love to talk to you about the Capitals. It's fun to talk about the Capitals and your team and see how they're doing on this podcast and on YouTube. But how about talking with me one-on-one about the Capitals? I'll give you my thoughts on free agency. I'll give you my thoughts on where I think the Capitals will end up at the end of the year. So join me on Subtext. You can find out how to join me in the show notes. All right, in this edition of Locked On Capitals, we talk about the Caps' hopes for a wild card spot. It was a big win the other night over the Buffalo Sabres, which put the Capitals in a bit of a better position. Ahead of them now is the Florida Panthers with 73. So actually looking at it right now, Washington has 73 points and Florida has 73. So it looks like a tie, but then you also have to take into consideration games in hand. Ahead of them is the New York Islanders with 78 and Pittsburgh 78. Is it ultimately doable for the Capitals to get a wild card spot? We'll talk about that in the show. Then a bit later, we will talk about what players on the Caps team right now are most likely going to move on in the offseason. And then later in the show, we will talk about the Caps blue line and Joe Snively. But just to get it going here, the game last night had some pretty big significance for me because we know there's not a lot of runway left, right, between now and the end of the year for the Caps to make this big push. And there are certain games that really stand out as this team galvanized and just really all pulling on that collective rope together. And last night was definitely one of those games. It was one of the games that was a bit familiar to Caps fans and the Caps themselves as they find themselves in the hole right away. Buffalo got on the board first, and then they got the second. And then all of a sudden, the Caps are trying to claw their way back into this game. And many times when you watch these games with the Caps, it seems like they just kind of give up right away. So if they're coming, from and they have to fight back against any sort of deficit, they just kind of are like a turtle and they stick their head in the shell and they're like, is this game over yet? Was a bit different last night. There was a feeling of we need to do this. It was like Alan May said. He said there was a feeling like it was an elimination game. And I think what's getting drawn into focus here primarily is the Capitals know there's not a lot of runway left between now and the end of the season. Just taking a look at the schedule here in particular, you can see that there's just not a lot of games left to be played. The last regular season game is on April 13th. So not too long from now, to be honest with you. Do the Capitals have what it takes in the tank to push them up to at least get to a wild card spot? A lot will be determined. I guess it depends upon the Florida Panthers. If they go on a heater, if they can kind of rescend a little bit. Also, if the Capitals can continue to keep applying the pressure, if they can continue to play like they played against the Sabres in some of the biggest matches here recently. If you want to take a look at, a little bit longer ago against the Bruins, and then not this last game against the Rangers, but the one before that. Certain moments where on paper you think there's no way the Caps are going to be able to win these games, and they're able to rally the troops and pick up big wins. And the game the other night, even though the Sabres aren't, near the top of their rankings there, it was still a big thing because we know the Capitals had a hard time against the Sabres. And, for them to be able to pick up a win was a big thing. So can they continue to keep riding that positive momentum going forward? That is a big thing for me and a good measuring stick. Ultimately, when you take a look at this team and just try to gauge, do they even have the potential of making it to the postseason? And, why I draw comparable to the Sabres is the last game. It seems like the Caps tried to reinvent the wheel on the fly, and they tried to match fire with the Sabres, and the Capitals lost. What it was in the last game is they kind of sensed that the Sabres, that they were kind of running away with the game, and they said, "That's not gonna happen this time. We're gonna win this game." And the Capitals ended up applying the pressure, and that they were able to come away with a big win. And Charlie Lindgren said as much as well. He said that he could tell that the things had changed throughout the game when all of a sudden the Caps started getting on the board and scoring goals. There was this pressure that was put on the Sabres that was insurmountable for them, and the Capitals ultimately ended up walking away from that game with a victory. Albeit it had to go to the shootout, but they were able to pick up the win. And it was just, for me, it was a moral boost for me to watch this team to claw their way back in, because it kind of speaks volumes about a team if they can come from behind and win a game that, in the beginning of the game you thought would have been lost. When you started watching the first period, two periods of the game, you kind of thought to yourself that this one is going to go to the Sabres again. And then all of a sudden the Capitals started getting engaged and just really throwing the kitchen sink at the Buffalo Sabres, and they found a way to rally the troops and win a game. But my question for you Caps fans out there, is it a little bit too much, a little bit too late? That's the question out there. Are they trying to apply the pressure too late in the season? Or do you think that it is possible that they are going to be able to find a way and claw their way into getting a wild card spot? It is a bit of an interesting thing, and I guess it's hard to say for sure, if they're going to be able to do it. I guess ultimately the Capitals are the only ones that are going to know that, if they can fight their way back into it. But what we're hoping for above anything else is that the Florida Panthers obviously don't keep winning games, because if you take a look at the wild card spot here right now, that is who is standing in their way. Washington 73, Florida 73, and then the Islanders and the Pittsburgh Penguins with 78 points. So a bit of a hill for the Caps to climb. Not insurmountable, but it is going to be difficult. But if they can kind of put what they did into a bottle and let that out every time they play a game, just them hitting them with both barrels. For me, when I watched the game, there was kind of that wry smile on TJ Oshie's face, like, we got this. And you know what? It's an interesting thing. And why it really stood out to me is they kind of zoomed up on him, and that kind of wry smile, like, we got this. He could tell that Caps team was engaged, and they were going to give that Sabres team all they could handle. And as it turns out, he was right. The Caps found a way to win that game, and it was just a really cool moment. Something I'll probably always remember. It was just an interesting look of just zooming up on Oshie's face, that look of confidence and a bit of a grin as he looks on that Sabres team like, not tonight. We're winning this one. And they ended up doing it. And just a really special moment for me as a longtime Caps fan to see that come to fruition. And it was done in large part with Ovi and Wilson and Kuznetsov and Oshie and all these guys out there, these veterans, this geriatric team that everyone around the NHL said is over and they should just give up and call it a day. Wasn't the case when they played the Sabres. And they proved to a lot of different people and a lot of different teams, and ultimately to themselves, that they could do it. And that's what they're going to need to do, is they have games coming up that are going to be tough games here. They're playing the Wild. That's going to be a tough out, while they're playing a little bit better now. But then after that, it's the Columbus Blue Jackets. They're going to have to make hay while the sun shines. And then they also have that game coming up against the Blackhawks. So those are must-win games and huge, huge opportunities for this Capitals team to, move up in the standings, to get more points. That's what it's all about. Who has the most points towards the end? It's going to be a shootout towards the end. And, it's going to be the Islanders, the Penguins, and the Panthers, and all these teams that are just vying for this wild card spot to find a way in there. And it's going to be interesting to see if the Capitals are one of those contenders in there, or is there another team that's really going to just pour it on. My hope for Capitals is that they're going to be able to find a way to make it in there. I know it's going to be an uphill climb, but I ultimately think they have what it takes. All right, so after the break here, I'm going to talk about some players on this active roster that are probably playing their last season on the Capitals. Who are those players? We'll talk about them next. The midway point of the NBA season is here, and now is the perfect time to download the FanDuel Sports app, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scores and threes drained. And guys, even if you're not into betting, you could bet up on an upcoming Wizards game. It makes watching the games that much more exciting. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to fanduel.com/slash locked on. That's fanduel.com/slash locked on to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. There's a piece that I was reading here about three Capitals that most likely played their last season with this team. And a couple of these guys should come as no surprise. Their name was linked during free agency as possibly being on the move. One of those players is Anthony Mantha. And I'll talk about him a little bit more in depth here. But we know that ultimately Anthony Mantha has not been as advertised. When we traded Jacob Vrana for Anthony Mantha, we thought we were going to get this, fast skater, this guy with a slick shot, and a big guy that's going to be, have a bit of a physical game. Well, that was true on a couple parts, but the part there about him being a physical guy couldn't be anything further from the truth. He can, check guys into the board, but if you're looking for a Tom Wilson 2.0, that is just not his big. That is not who he is. But let's just push that side for a moment. It's not even that about Anthony Mantha. The biggest thing about Mantha is his hot and cold nature. The game before, he played really well, and then subsequently he didn't play as well. So it vacillates where he goes well, plays well, and then he doesn't. To get a sweater every night in the National Hockey League, you need to play consistently night in and night out. There's certain, teams and certain players, that have a bit of leeway, a bit more of a longer leash. If Alex Ovechkin goes on a bit of a dry streak, I think he's probably going to get a bit of a leeway. Same goes for Nick Backstrom, TG Oshie, those kind of things. But these guys that are kind of on the fringe, like Mantha in particular, they need to perform or it's probably going to spell the end of the season. Are they going to trade him? Are they going to buy him out? I guess it remains to be seen. This piece was in the Hockey Writers. They said the Caps have dragged this out long enough. Anthony Mantha was once a top-line player in Detroit until the trade that brought him over. The Caps thought they were getting that player, but in fact got a very inconsistent middle six forward at best who has not fit in on the Capitals. A change of scenery is very much needed, and they can accommodate that with either a buyout before the final year of his contract, or they can dump him to a different team. And that was kind of my assessment as well. So that's what we're up against. And I don't think that any of the Caps fans should be surprised. I don't think that Anthony Mantha himself should be surprised. And I don't think he is surprised that this is most likely his last year. Is he going to be able to land on his feet and get a job in the NHL? That is even the bigger question. But tough thing for Anthony Mantha. Seems like a pretty solid, decent guy, but just, decent guys and, good guys in the locker room. That's not what it's about. It's about winning hockey games at the end of the day. The Caps aren't looking to rebuild while Ovi is still on the team, which means they're going to continue the quick retool to try and get back in playoff contention next season. The roster is fairly full of talent, especially after already extending Sonny Milano and Dylan Strome. Mantha has 1 goal and 3 points in the last 18 games and just recently snapped a 12-game pointless drought. So it is a tough thing for Anthony Mantha. I think that he's trying. I really do. And that's the frustrating part for Anthony. That's the frustrating thing for the fans and myself included, is it's not that I don't think that he's trying. I just think that he lost his touch. And, that's unfortunate, but I don't think the Caps should keep him around just because he's a good guy and he's trying hard. You need to get results. He has a cap hit of 5.7 million average annual value for 1 more year And instead of playing in the top six, has actually been a healthy scratch and played on the fourth line at times. With his lack of production and large cap hit, the Caps have to do something about it in the offseason and end this long, drawn out saga. And I do agree with that assessment. I just think, are the Capitals ultimately going to pull the trigger on that? Are they going to buy him out? I'm not always in love with the idea of buying them out because, then you're just kind of paying a guy that's not here anymore. This piece also as well in the Washington Hockey Now, Sammy Silver was talking about how he was absent for the most part in the game against the Sabres. In the third period of Wednesday's must-win showdown between the Caps and the Sabres, Anthony Mantha found himself watching the rest of regulation and overtime from the bench as head coach Peter Laviolette shuffled the lines and elected to hold number 39 out of the mix. Again, frustrating, kind of feel for the guy. I wish he could perform. I know the Caps hope he could perform, but he can't do it. And to a certain extent, you either need to figure it out or the Caps need to move on from him. And I think that the latter is probably going to be true. Mantha did not skate for the final 14:38 of regulation, nor did he get any ice time in the 5 minutes, 3-on-3 overtime period. His team ultimately rallied back from 3-1 and 4-2 deficits to force extra time and secure a 5-4 victory in the shootout. He did not appear to suffer any injury in the game that saw Nick Jensen go down in the third, while Rasmus Sandin also suffered in that game as well. So that's the tough thing about Mantha is if he's going to be able to find a spot anywhere, unless he's just happy with being this extreme depth piece on a team that's struggling. Could he be a good fit? I hate to say it, for like the Coyotes or the Blue Jackets, or think of pretty much any deplorable team in the NHL that's looking for a depth piece. That's what it's ultimately come to for Anthony Mantha, and he's either going to accept it or he's going to retire or he's going to get sent down to the AHL, but he's going to have to refine his game in a hurry if it's not. I think that ultimately this is his last season in Washington, but even widening the lens out a little bit more for Anthony, if he wants a job in the NHL period, he's really going to have to step it up. And, some people would say, well, he's not going to be able to step up sitting on the bench. Listen, he has been given plenty of opportunities to prove who he is as a player. He's just fallen short. And it's ultimately a tough thing for Anthony Mantha, but the Caps need to be in the winning business, not about, keeping a guy around just because he's a nice person. The other guy on the list here is Craig Smith, and it doesn't really come as any surprise. I mean, he has shown flashes of greatness so far on the Caps, but it is my contention that ultimately Boston wanted his contract off the books, and they said that if you want to get those draft picks, you are going to have to take the draft picks and Craig Smith with you. Smith was a cap dump at the trade deadline so that the Boston Bruins could afford to bring in Dmitry Orlov and Garnet Hathaway. A once productive middle six winger has fallen very hard this season and has gone for a career average of nearly 15 minutes of ice time on ice per game to under 10:30. He has produced offense like a fourth liner, and even at a much cheaper cap hit, his drop off isn't encouraging for the Caps to warrant keeping him around. I ultimately agree with that. I think the Caps don't need to settle for mediocrity. They need to settle for players, and not even settle. Just strike that from the record. They need to get players on this team that are engaged in winning. The truly, truly great teams out there that play so well have great players up and down the lineup. Take a look at Boston. How many Anthony Manthas and Craig Smiths, he was just on that team, do they have on that team? Or take a look at some of the other better teams in the league that are out there. Take a look at Carolina or the Rangers or the Devils or, fill in the blank team. They don't have a lot of filler on the team. It's all killer, no filler, right? And that's what it's ultimately got to be if you want to be a successful team, not only in the National Hockey League, but in baseball or football. You can't keep guys around because you got them on a cheap deal and they're nice guys to have in the locker room. And those are all great things, but you need guys that when they're called upon can go out there and really play well. And Craig Smith, again, a very small sample size. There's been glimpses of greatness, but ultimately, does it warrant keeping him around? And the last guy in this, to follow up on this segment here, is Connor Sherry, and it should come as no surprise. Connor Sherry has shown glimpses of greatness as well, but ultimately, I think they kind of just kept him around because they knew the Caps were going to make a push at the end of the season. But I think that once we get to free agency, I think that ultimately he will probably seek greener pastures. Speaking of Sherry, it seems as though he is going to be moving on for a number of reasons. The Caps would be rewarding him and slotting him higher in the lineup at this point of the season if they had plans to keep him around. He has 12 goals and 31 points and is on the fourth line. Though his average ice time on ice is much higher than that of a fourth liner, the team has elected to play two unproductive forwards, Mantha and Smith, ahead of him in the lineup from Connor Sherry, balancing newborn duties with the rigors of the NHL season. It just seems like that is going to be likely. Sherry is on a great deal with the Caps and has consistently been underpaid and undervalued throughout his career. After putting up 23 goals and 53 points in 61 games for the Pens in the final year of his rookie deal, he was paid just $3 million per season. He has now scored 10 plus goals in 7 consecutive seasons, and the Caps are only paying him $1.5 million. He will be a UFA that should be looking for a payday and a larger role with another team. And it's ultimately my take. I think that, they underpaid him, but he agreed to those terms. I do think he has a pretty good skill set. The things I like about Connor Sherry is he's fine playing on the first line. He's fine playing on the fourth line, just goes about his business. But at the end of the day, I could see the Caps moving on from him for better or for worse. And I think that is ultimately what's going to be the case. All right. So after the break here, we are going to talk about Joe Snively as he gets reassigned to Hershey. And ultimately, does he fit in with the Capitals' plans for the future? We'll talk about him next. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, your team every day. So, Joe Snively is a bit of an interesting character. He has seen, kind of jumped up and down between Hershey and Washington and back and forth and back and forth. And I got to say, ultimately, that Joe Snively does a pretty solid job when he's here. He kind of rose to prominence last season. Just due to injuries, he got a promotion, and I think kind of surprised everyone in the room by playing much better than everyone thought. And that is how he found a job on the Caps, and he got a new deal with the team and all that kind of thing. But ultimately, then he faced an injury, right? And then that kind of sidelined him. And now he hasn't been able to find a consistent role on this team night in and night out, or in the NHL in general. I think that ultimately he fits in the Capitals' long-term plans. I think that, once the summer shakes out and we see what players, get traded away or just sign contracts somewhere else, I think that Joe Snively will have a spot on this team. I'm not so sure if it's going to be next year because I think there's guys in front of him, see Hendrix Lapierre and Connor McMichael, those kind of players. But I do think if he's patient, he still is a bit of a younger guy, a hometown kid story that is, the makings of a Disney movie. So I think that if he's patient, I think he will find a spot on long term on this Capitals team. It's just going to take some time. And it's a tough thing for these guys that fight so hard, but they just don't find a spot on the team. The Caps have loaned forward Joe Snively to the Hershey Bears. The AHL Senior Vice President GM Brian McClellan announced today. Snively has recorded 3 points in 8 games with Washington this season. The Virginia native became the first Virginia-born player to play for the Caps in franchise history last season. In 12 games in 21-22, Snively recorded 7 points, including a 3-point effort on February 10th, 2022 against the Canadiens. Snively became one of the 15 rookies in franchise history to record at least 7 points in his first 10 games. In his 20 career NHL games with the Caps, Snively has recorded 10 points. And again, that's my assessment on him, is he just needs to be patient. Snively, 27, was never drafted, but signed a 2-year deal with the Caps in 2019 for $925,000 per year. The Caps re-signed Snively to a 1-year, 2-way contract extension on July 3rd, 2021, and re-signed him to a 2-year deal on March 16th, 2022. He will be a restricted free agent in the 24-25 season, writes Nova Cap. So, long-term projection for him, I do see him having a role on this team, probably not going to be next year. I think there's some guys, in queue that are ahead of him, but my projection for him is he will find a spot on this team at some point. It just might be, maybe 2-3 years out, but I think that the sky's the limit for him. I think he's got a lot of potential. And the thing that I like about him, kind of above and beyond even some of the other players that have been called up, some of the crown jewels of the Capitals organization, is that when he comes up and he gets his opportunity, he produces. And that's the big thing. And that's what really stands about him, about Joe Snively, even, more than Hendrix Lapierre and Connor McMichael, is that when he comes here, he's not, like, I'm that guy that you've all heard about and I don't do anything. He kind of comes up here hungry, wanting to perform. He's not one of the sexy names of the Hershey Bears. But when he does come here, he makes the most of his opportunity. And I'm excited to see what Joe Snively's future is for this Capitals team. Thank you for making Locked On Capitals your first listen today. Now make your second listen Locked On Game to Game NHL. Every moment, every top performance, every result. Locked On Game to Game covers every game across the NHL with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. Follow Locked On Game to Game NHL, available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you find your podcasts. So once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals. If you're listening to this on your favorite podcatcher, whether it be Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, wherever, make sure and hit that subscribe button. That way you will know when the new podcasts are available. And then when you're done there, make sure and go over to YouTube and hit that subscribe button. We're at about 460 subscribers. I have you guys to thank for that. Let's see if we can get it up to 500. Also, if you enjoy talking Caps, I enjoy talking Caps even when I'm not doing this podcast. I'd love to talk Capitals with you. Join me on Subtext. You can join me on Subtext. Just take a look at the show notes and follow the link, and that way we can text back and forth talking about Caps. It'll be so much fun. So once again, thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Dan Holme, and I'll talk to you again next time.